So, hello everybody to Luftchat Nummer 2, number 2. Once again, we are joined here by the Austrian guy who's not a corporal, luckily, from the Military History Visualized channel. He's a bit shy. He doesn't say hello.
Well, it's my part where I should say hello. Okay.
Yeah,
Hello everybody. It's me, Bernard, from the Military History channel.
Yes, and of course me, your trusty Bismarck. Today we're going to talk a little bit about memoirs, specifically World War II memoirs, kind of making a breakdown of what we think you should take into account when you read one. And we have, I think, few opinions on the kind of ideas and how to evaluate the kind of biographies and accounts that come out from World War II that are being sold on the streets even right now. It's amazing how even 70 years after these events, people have still a lot of interest into the accounts of some of the leading or well-known figures of World War II. For me, of course, being more of a fighter pilot guy, of course, virtual. I'm mostly interested into kind of the pilot perspective, so I'm hoping here that Bernard will shed a little bit of light on the other aspects and the other kind of parts of World War II with the memoirs that we have right there. So I think I'll just hand it over to you now, Bernard, and you can kind of give us the kind of breakdown that you think we should take into account when you have a memoir book in front of you.
Yeah, I think there are three basic levels to structure if you look at a memoir. I think there are basically three types. The low level memoir from guys like that were directly in the cockpit, directly in the trenches, or set directly in a tank, that did the fighting at the very front line. The lower guys usually.
Yeah, the boots on the ground, the roughneck, jarhead kind of person.
Exactly. And then there's the mid level. This is of officers or officials that served like up to battalion, even division level, that were concerned with the operational stuff, and they, to a certain degree, for instance, also met Hitler, like Rudel did, for instance, when he got promoted or got the Knight's Cross and other stuff. They have some glimpses into the whole big thing, but they're still on the outside.
So mainly tactical level kind of stuff.
Yeah, tactical operational level, yeah. And then there's the third level, the high level officials. This is people like field marshals, Generaloberst like Guderian. For instance, to name a few names, Speer, high level official, Adolf Galland, General der Jagdflieger.
For the uninitiated, can you explain who Speer was?
Speer was an architect, and he took over after Todt died and was responsible for the armament industry.
Yeah.
And usually he's attributed with the Wunder, the Rüstungswunder, the armament wunder that happened in Germany, which actually is just a myth, but he was also really good in marketing.
Okay.
And other people would be Manstein, of course, and Guderian at that level.
So how do you think their kind of memoirs, taking this structure into account, differ from one and another? And what do you have to take into account when you, for example, let's take the low level kind of guy. If you read an account by this guy, what are the things that you would say, you have to pay attention here if he talks about, let's say a low level guy criticizes strategic decisions, invasions of certain countries or certain offensive launches or counterattacks and so on. What would you then say if you read that memoir? Is that criticism that can be valid, or does this person perhaps lack a little bit of the overall picture?
Yeah, that's the main problem. Usually they don't take into account the big strategic decision, and sometimes even can't grasp the fully operational decisions. And I think a friend once told me he interviewed a few World War II veterans from Austria, and he asked all of them something like, "Did you think Operation Barbarossa could be successful?" And some replied, No, we realized very early on it was nearly impossible because they had so much tanks and so much people,
Okay.
whereas others responded nearly with the same observation. They said, we captured so many people and we destroyed so many tanks. So it was kind of like, yeah, it was kind of obvious that we would win because no nation can sustain such amount of damage.
Okay. So what you're saying essentially is here, if you're somebody in the field who has to take the brunt of the fighting, you perhaps lack the strategic insight into why those opinions are like why those attacks are happening or why you're defending and so on.
Yeah, that and another aspect is of course the psychological aspect. These people saw friends next to them die.
Oh yes,
They
absolutely.
killed people and all this. And if, for instance, let's take some petty arguments that happen on the internet. I had my fair share of them, and I'm usually quite invested in them.
Mhm.
But nobody shed any blood for these arguments, for these opinions ever. And these people fought for 5 years sometimes. They spent their whole youth. They got traumatized in something. And to a certain degree, change certain viewpoints for them would be like fighting the war all over again.
Mhm.
When sometimes even we nowadays who never shot a shot in anger or got wounded or something like that can't often change our opinion about very mundane topics. That's also a very important part which usually people completely ignore.
Well, when you say now changing opinions, actually that reminds me of a Japanese pilot whose memoir I read, who said that essentially when he was kind of an enlisted low-level pilot, actually he wasn't enlisted, he was a volunteer, um, he felt like the war was going really well for Japan. And once he was put in charge of, a flight, and then he was made an officer and so on, he was given more information about how the war is progressing, and he was shocked to find out that all these tactical decisions that they were informed of as kind of the lower level kind of pilots, were going away from this area as a tactical retreat, so the Americans in the jungle have more attrition and so on, was actually not really true, but those were complete military losses that occurred at that moment, and the propaganda just wrongly informed even the own soldiers. But the officers knew about it, but the normal soldiers didn't. And as he progressed through the ranks, he started getting more access to information that he previously didn't have, and it completely changed his perception of how the war was going. Interested, it's Saburo Sakai's book, Samurai. The only caveat with that book is that I've heard from multiple sources that the English translation, which is what I read, has some lost in translation issues where a certain amount of things that happened were, let's say, beefed up, made more spectacular, whereas the real Japanese book, the original, doesn't have this kind of over the top writing. So that's, I think, also something that we should mention here, that you have to take into account these lost in translation moments. I don't know if you have any example for that.
I don't know about the problems of translation in that regard, but yeah, usually quite some information can get lost, especially because the cultural difference.
Yeah.
And also, if you watch, for instance, certain British documentary and an American documentary, you usually figure out that the amount of hyperbole used in one of them is far lower than in the other. So it kind of makes sense that certain translators beef up the language a bit.
Yeah, you do need to take into account, the specific cultural transmission of ideas and interpretation and concepts when you take into account things. But we didn't yet talk about the high level kind of memoirs and what you have to take into account when you read those. So once again, I'll just hand it over to you.
At a high level, officials there, this is really important, especially for instance with Adolf Galland.
Mm-hmm.
He basically continued in his memoir to a certain degree the discussions and debates he had during the war about how the Messerschmitt 262, for instance, should be used.
Yeah, the book is called Die Ersten und die Letzten, by the way. The first and the last, I think, in English, for anybody who's listening.
So the main problem is here. He tried to get the Messerschmitt 262 to be a fighter, and of course he thought this was the right decision. So he will continue, usually in his memoir, if he sticks to that, in a certain way to portray it that way, that this was the better decision.
Oh yeah.
And that the other was the wrong decision. So basically he continues his internal war that went on behind the front in the German leadership. And even if he tries to keep it as objective as possible, to a certain degree, the human memory is not able to do this. There's a very good book on this, The Seven Sins of Memory from Daniel Schechter, which I recommend as reading to everyone. But once you read that book and you hear the phrase, I remember exactly, you will either roll your eyes or you will burst out laughing.
Yeah, actually, yeah, I remember, this discussion that Galland keeps going on. Especially, he rips a lot into the bomber command of the Germans, and then trying to still get a lot of resources to the bombers in 44 and 45, and obviously you need fighters and so on. He continues with that discussion, and he always says like, what could have been if only. And while his book, I do recommend his book, by the way, Die Ersten und die Letzten, the first and the last. But once again, like we said, keep an account of what these people, what their role was in the war, and what they, from their perspective, would like to convey. And I personally, I think it's maybe going a little bit far if we would say they will attempt to misinform, but it's more as they see it from their perspective, and obviously that's the way things should be done. That's the way things should be handled. But I think we pretty much rounded it up pretty nicely there. Do you have any concluding remarks you'd like to say?
Yeah, so basically as a little conclusion, so when you read a memoir, you should be aware what additional information this person can provide, and in which areas you should be especially cautious when he makes a remark. And just because he was there doesn't mean he talks the truth, intentionally or unintentionally. That's especially important. I don't claim that anyone intentionally misinforms someone.
No.
It's just how our brain works.
Yeah. And also, I mean, there's also a difference between the casual reader and somebody like you, for example, who reads this stuff from, a more scientific kind of approach. And especially you said, you read The Seven Sins of Memory. And after reading that, obviously you'll spot a few things in these books where you might be, inclined to burst out laughing, like you said. But yeah, I think that rounds us up pretty nicely here. All the people that are listening to this, if you have any kind of opinion on this, put them down below. If you have any kind of book recommendation on, for example, memoirs of during the Second World War, put them down below as well. Definitely interested in hearing and seeing all your recommendations. That's it for us. I'm gonna say bye here. Thank you very much, Bernhard, for this discussion.
Thank you very much too for having me.
Yeah, we will see you in Luftchat number 3. Have a great day.
Yeah, you too. See you.